We
This
have
conference will now be recorded.
This is Paul Moody. He is a former HPRA inspector. He's also a QP, and we're fortunate enough to have him now working with us at Alexion. He's going to be speaking as we discussed data integrity with some observations from his perspective. Without further ado, here's Paul.
Christopher, thanks very much. Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to kind of speak to you all today in this knowledge sharing series on really some of my thoughts on data integrity and trying to link in those to some of the publicly available regulatory findings. The presentation itself is based around the PICS Good Practice draft document, and throughout the presentation I'll go through really, for those that aren't aware what PICS is, we'll take a look at some data governance and assessing the data lifecycle, and look at electronic systems and records, paper systems and records, the business process, and then we'll put it all together and have some case studies. So really the theory side will be a skip through some of the highlights of the PICS document, and then we try and look at some of the regulatory findings that are publicly available anyway, regulatory findings and that may have been associated with those types of issues. So firstly, I suppose, what is PICS? And for those that don't know, it's a pharmaceutical inspection cooperation scheme. It's a regulators group, not an industry, with 52 participating authorities, and it was first established in 1995. And the countries there on the screen in blue really are those who are those participating authorities. So for those guys in the US and Canada, your authorities are also part of this. It's an international development, implementation and maintenance of harmonized GMP standards and quality systems of inspectorates in the field of medicinal products. They also have their own GMP guidance document, which has been adopted by some countries into their own, so basically taken in, but it's heavily based on the EU GMP guide. Having said that, where those documents haven't been adopted, it is a non-binding, informal, cooperative arrangement between regulatory authorities in the GMP space. And it's also used for cooperation and networking between competent authorities, regional and international organizations, to give some sort of mutual confidence. So I've given you the logo there and a link to the website. When you go into the website, really it's built primarily for regulators, inspectors, investigators, whatever you like to call them. There's a small piece with industry documents, but there's a lot of aid memoirs that regulators may use. And it's all publicly available, so none of this stuff is kind of hidden from people. It's all there. And then looking at it, what I've really pulled out here is the latest version, I suppose, of the draft PICS Good Practices for Data Management and Integrity in Regulated GMP, GDP Environments document, and I've listed the table of contents there. It's a 52-page document. It is a draft at the moment, but it certainly is worth a read. It gives, I suppose, the regulators some trigger questions to ask when they're trying to identify certain areas. The draft 3, which is out, is currently available for comment. Some of the new kind of areas that have been added to it versus draft 2 from the year before last is there's a section on computerized system validation expectations, which is pushing the prospective data integrity assessments as part of system selection, which was always, I suppose, from the European side inherent within Annex 11, but it's called out explicitly here. And then there's a section on hybrid systems and the validation expectation for that. The PICS group have asked for focused stakeholder consultation, and the ISP have been selected as one of the bodies for this consultation. And what they're really after is specific questions relating to the proportionality, clarity, and implementation of the guidance requirements. And I do encourage you to have a read of the document, jot down your comments, and if you have any questions relating to the specifics there, relay those on to Chris Clark at 101010 Consulting UK. By the 22nd of February. That, I suppose, that's the only caveat there. The close for comments by PICS is the 28th of February, so Chris will need to consolidate those before submitting. So moving on to data governance and assessing the data lifecycle. Well, firstly, what is data governance? It's the sum of total arrangements which provide assurance of data integrity, and it may be beneficial to provide a summary document in your organization which outlines your total approach to this governance. It should be essential to the pharmaceutical quality system and have a risk management approach considering data risk and criticality at each stage of the data life cycle. And it's an iterative approach to identification, mitigation, review and communication. So over time it gets better and better. And it really ensures controls over data life cycle are commensurate to QRM, which is what all of the the regulations in general are looking for QRM type aspects. It can be organizational or technical. Organizational data governance really looks at around the procedures and instructions for completion and retention of completed paper data. It looks at the training of employees and documented authorization for data generation and approval, regular verification of data, and periodic surveillance of the governance policy. And the technical aspects really will be the computerized system control and automation aspects. The governance system itself should demonstrate management commitment, include evidence of communication and expectations to all personnel, and really empower people to report failures and opportunity for improvement. And it calls that out. And it demonstrates an understanding of data criticality risk and the life cycle. And then, like all GXP documents, should undergo a regular review. So what is the data life cycle? That's it there on this slide. And really, it really looks to describe the various stages that data can have, from its generation through processing, reporting, checking, decision-making, storage, until it's finally retired or discarded. So it's all the way through the life cycle. And when you want to assess the life cycle, each stage needs to be looked at. And the life cycle, I suppose it's very important to point out that it includes both electronic and paper-based data. There seems to be a tendency to keep it as electronic and just think in the electronic bubble, but it links into paper as well. So some considerations for life cycle review. Well, you can have different type of data categories, and these could be organizational or internal. There could be data moving through production, through QA, through QC with interfaces, be they manual or automated. Or it could be external, with looking at the contract giver and acceptor type aspects, and these could be used for cloud-based applications and storage. And again, the data lifecycle crosses both paper and electronic records. And if you're looking at assessing computerized systems, you really need a two-pronged approach to this. You want somebody from IT who understands the architecture of the system, with the business process owner who understands the process and the significance of the outputs. And you have to apply critical thinking skills, because you're looking for gaps in your data governance and challenges to your procedural and system controls. So you're trying to think outside the box, not simply are we following procedure, but are the procedures any good is what you want to be looking for there. So to do that, you need to know what data is important. So you need to understand criticality and risk, and what's the data's importance to product quality and safety. So all data or processing steps don't have the same importance to product quality and patient safety. You want to minimize potential risk to data integrity. So you want to focus the effort and resource proportionally against the product quality risk. And to do this, you need to utilize risk management. So data criticality is really the impact to decision making and quality. And so what decision does the data influence? So is a piece of data looking at a critical quality attribute for back certification? And even within a critical quality attribute, what's the impact of product quality or safety? So, for example, an assay result for a product would have greater importance than a dimensional issue. There'd be more impact. So even within criticality, there's levels of criticality. And then data risk itself, what's the opportunity for data alteration or deletion, and the likelihood of detection and visibility of changes by the routine review process. And that's really key. Usually you kind of see, okay, everybody's following procedures, there's not supposed to be any data alteration, and that's fine. But it may be intentional or unintentional. But if it happens, what's the likelihood of detection of that? So the data risk assessment should assess and mitigate the vulnerability to both voluntary and involuntary amendments to the data lifecycle, and really have a business process focus, again, not just an IT system, looking at process complexity, looking at the consistency, the subjectivity of outcome of results, is it a number or a visual assessment, and the outcome of a comparison between an electronic system or a manual record. And each stage of the data lifecycle for the business process should be reviewed. And consideration for, is the process open-ended or well-defined? Does it come to a point, or is there some interpretation? And ensuring that manual interfaces with systems are considered within this process. Computerized system validation in isolation may result in an incorrectly assigned low data integrity risk, and really in particular where the user is able to influence the reporting of data from the validated system. So that would be doing a test 5 times and just printing out the 5th result, that kind of aspect. And in data generation and recording, then really the questions on how and where is the original data recorded? Is it a manual entry to a system from a display? Is it automated capture? And what metadata might be associated with that data? Really, you want to ensure completeness and accuracy of data, and can the event be reconstructed from the record? And where are the data and metadata located would be part of the assessment. Is it in a batch record, is it in a logbook or an electronic system, or perhaps there's pieces in all three? Is the data in permanent memory or held in a buffer or temporary storage at the time of recording? Because where it's temporary storage, this provides a limited audit trail, which in itself is a risk. So that should be removed and reduced in as far as possible. So is it possible to recreate, amend or delete original data or metadata? So this would include the ability of IT help desks or database administrators. So looking at the back end. So on the front end, you'll have your user access control, but then who's doing the maintenance? What controls are there? If a record wants to be changed, what controls are there? Is there a segregation of duty between your front end administrators and your database administrators? What about users at sister sites for multi-site enterprise type systems? What influence does one site have on the other? And then when you're looking at it from site to site, what rights do they have what rights do site A have in site B in site B's process, and should they have any? Changes should be procedurally controlled and visible within the quality system. So then also, how is data transferred to other locations or systems for processing and storage? You want to protect it again from intentional and unintentional loss, amendment and substitution, because I think a lot of it is really unintentional stuff. Does the interface correctly and completely transfer the data to the reporting screen or report? So does the end user who's making the decision see the relevant and correct and accurate data? Is that process validated? Is it readable by the system on installation or update? It may involve conversion of existing data as upgrades go on, or maintenance of old software data. How is that managed to ensure the readability through the data lifecycle for investigation? So it might be an old system which is linked to a validation supporting a product. How do you recreate that old data if you've retired the system? Data processing then to usable information. How is data processed? Is it through approved revision controlled methods or validated algorithms? How is the processing recorded? If it's done multiple times, each iteration should really be available to the checker for verification, not just the final result, the final processing. Does the person processing the data have the ability to influence what's reported or how it's presented? Do they choose what's printed, reported, or transferred or to the LIMS system, for example, to be reviewed? And can it be performed multiple times with separate events and desired outcomes only reported? Moving on to checking completeness and accuracy. Is the original data format available for checking? Is it electronic or paper? Does it permit interaction with data, search and query it? And this is important, I suppose, for risk-based reviews. Is it a risk-based type review for exception reporting? Because you really want to target, if there's an issue, can you target where the issue happened on a review, or can the reviewer do that? Is there any period of time where the data is not audit trailed? So this is an opportunity for data amendment. Does the reviewer have access to all data generated, inclusive of that from failed or aborted activities? And does the reviewer have access to all processing of data? And this would manage data exclusion and undisclosed processing into compliance. When data then is used for a decision, is it before the record is saved to permanent memory? Is it maybe manipulated prior to the checks by a reviewer? And some LIMS systems, when you input the result and before you commit that data, it will alert that it's out of spec. And that's an issue, because then you can delete it and put in a correct result, and nobody knows what the original result that was typed in. And again, on some chromatographic systems, you can review it and assess live chromatographic injections, and they're not committed to results. And they're data integrity gaps. So for retrieval and disposal, how and where is it stored? What are the measures protecting it against lost or unauthorized amendment? And this itself is its own business process, so the measures will be similar to earlier. Is it backed up in a manner that permits the reconstruction of the activity? Is it validated and validated for the particular storage time? What are the ownership retrieval arrangements, particularly for outsourced activities or data storage? Are there quality agreements in place and audits in place? I suppose as the contract giver, you're still ultimately responsible for that data. Even if it's subcontracted out, that's your business decision to do that. The data retention period then, there are regulatory requirements and data criticality, so that are the requirements met for validation versus routine batch, they're different. The data disposal authorizations that should be procedurized with quality unit approval for the disposal. Looking at some electronic systems and records, the design and control of electronic data is important. So user access should be controlled. Original data should not be able to be deleted. Audit trails should be retained, and procedures outlining policy and processes for audit trail review should be in place. should be a schedule of ongoing audit trail review based on criticality and system complexity. Sometimes this could be annual, sometimes this could be 6 monthly, or sometimes it could be every iteration, depending on how critical that data is. The computerized system design should ensure compliance with data integrity. And discrepancy and escalation procedures should be in place and inclusive of regulatory notification. Just looking at electronic records and audit trails, my approach is always I try to bring everything back to paper and make it simple. So here we have an example of a very poorly filled in laboratory piece of information by myself. I wouldn't have me in a laboratory, but this is how I filled in this piece of paper. If that was electronic and on an electronic audit trail, how might that look? And it would really be tabulated information, but the table of information there is essentially the same as the information that's listed on the paper record. So when looking at audit trails and looking at the type of information and trying to decide what's a critical audit trail, just bring it back to what would be accessible on paper and what would not be accessible on paper. I've always found that to be a useful technique. So the review of electronic data then as the original record. The risk of associated paper review may not include all relevant records, so there might be uninvestigated out of spec or other data anomalies. This would enable reviewing electronic data as the original would enable detection of data manipulation, deletion, amendments, duplication, reuse, or fabrication. Risk-based review is acceptable when principles are applied and it's scientifically justified, and this usually manifests itself in exception-type reporting, which allows focus of review to critical areas and the depth of review, but these must be appropriately validated. And I suppose the validation is only as good as the criteria is validated against, would be my kind of comment there. And on the right here, there's some of the types of findings that kind of linked to electronic data sets. Here we have audit trail comments were not always sufficiently detailed in this particular case, where an integration method on a chromatography data system had a comment that saved documented an awful lot of the time. Administrators had full access, system access, and this was not justified. I always think that there should really. It's unusual to have somebody with full access to absolutely everything. An administrator then should never really have access to the processing or processing of the data or the business process aspects, but really the administration aspects would generally be acceptable. Generic usernames and passwords, which are sometimes used as a way of managing user IDs and access to certain laboratory systems, but in general, it seems to be findings against them because these accounts could be utilised on other clients then to do other data manipulation, and there's no real accountability as to who was managing it. Administrator audit trail reviews performed by administrators, again bringing this back to paper. Essentially, you're reviewing your own work, which is not acceptable. The next point is really the process did not adequately restrict personnel from data. So there may be somebody in doing performance or PMs on some equipment, but they had access to the product data. So the question will be asked is, well, why does somebody performing maintenance on a system need access to that data? And if they don't, then they shouldn't have it. Laboratory test review processes didn't consider the raw data, and there was also potential then for result selection. So really no procedure for the review of electronic data is the issue there. And then again, system authorization concepts were not always considered, and that users could be administrators with full system access and also have batch manufacturing responsibilities in this particular case. So they had a vested interest in the output of the process. Looking at a paper system and records, so it's not all electronic. And really the design and control of the paper system should follow good documentation practices, and this is a requirement in all regulations. And the record really needs to maintain the Alcoa Plus aspects throughout its life cycle. With templates or blank forms, there should be a unique reference and revision control. It should be linked to an associated procedure and have a secure electronic signature where warranted. Loose form distribution, which is kind of tied into some electronic document management systems. They should really have a distribution date and sequence issuing number, and the number of location of copies distributed should be known. And that's really to design, I believe, from the PICS document to avoid photocopying. And I guess this is one of the aspects, the requirements of electronic systems is they should really meet the requirements of paper, and this has been lost on electronic documentation systems in particular. Everybody can just print out a page or print out a form, and that distribution aspect, which when you brought it back to paper would have to be issued typically by the quality unit, and it was always big trouble if it went missing. That aspect is going to be completely lost, And I think this is trying to redress that. The purpose then of controls, it's really to ensure the risk of inappropriate use and/or falsifying by ordinary means is reduced to an acceptable level. And then looking at paper-based systems, really the meaning of a signature, and this particular issue, the integrity of data with respect to the documented checks for volume and witnessing for a particular process manual addition was considered deficient in that on two separate occasions, as captured through some investigations, personnel had signed to indicate that they'd confirmed the volume check and witnessed manual additions, when those activities were subsequently confirmed not to have taken place. On further investigation, it was determined that personnel did not fully understand the expectations and significance of such signatures and checks. So really, the people didn't understand what confirmed meant and what witnessed meant. So you might have, your documents may have a written by or authored by, there might be a review, there might be approve, and there might be an authorized. There might be verify, and there might be checked. So all of those need to be defined. What do they actually mean? What's the difference between verify and what's the difference between review? Is review just making sure everything is filled in, whereas does verify mean that the actual item has been witnessed or seen by somebody else? In the case here, no action was taken by the company to address these ambiguities, and no strategy put in place to prevent recurrence. So this then appeared to lead to a wider issue, that there then questions over the validity and acceptability of the controls. So then does anybody know what they're signing? So can you trust the documentation at all? Looking then at some generic and general poor documentation practices. There was no verification check in this case to ensure that the USDF pressure reading was correctly transcribed onto the batch record. So then it's a visual comparison of one to the other. Or loose forms for cold chain management were not adequately controlled, and that the system could not identify when a form was lost. Training records performed on a particular date were completed on forms with the defect types to be identified had been pre-populated. Records of the original training were not maintained, and training was not documented contemporaneously. There's no system in place to ensure that all titrations performed were recorded in the logbook. So looking for aborted and failed issues there. Taking a look then at data integrity and the business process. Two things I was going to say to people were always think of the data life cycle. Think of the generation, processing, reporting, checking, decision-making, storage, retiring and discarding, and bring it in the electronic records, paper records, procedures, people, and front and back ends for those processes. And the business process. Apologies for the typo here. But for what I kind of have noted, I suppose, in my personal experience is that validations, typically a system boundary approach is used, where you've got a system boundary and you're going to validate what's inside the system. And I've tried to represent that by the small chain links there. It's usually equipment or instruments, application modules, historian modules, reporting modules, archival and backup modules. But what's an appropriate system boundary for data? Is it the computerized system, the procedures, the manual interfaces, outsourcing? Is it the business process? Is it the production process? Is it just the QC process? I think really you need to consider the entire life cycle over the entire business process in terms of data integrity. So from generation to retiring. And don't forget the back-end processes. Really looking at the data chain of custody all the way through. And then tracing data through the data life cycle is like joining the dots, bringing in the process complexity, consistency and subjectivity of the outcome of the result. And really it's illustrated by the link between those smaller system boundary approaches that are typically used for validating systems. And I suppose the entire process is only as good as its weakest link, which I've tried to illustrate here with a cable tie. So putting all of that together, or joining the dots. A typical example here is during a facility walkthrough tour, it was noticed that the clock on a filter integrity tester was 8 minutes slower than the manufacturing execution system. So a small inaccuracy on the clock. Question, I wonder how this looks on the associated electronic batch record, given there's an 8-minute difference. So the team followed the data and metadata, which was a timestamp through the business process from system to system. And it determined that the data utilized for batch-related GMP decisions was pushed from the filter integrity tester to the MES historian. The electronic batch record then selected its data based on the MES historian timestamp. And it was noted that in some cases it was possible to resend old tests from the instrument log by pressing the print key on the instrument log. They would then go to the data historian and were assigned a historian timestamp related to the resend date and not the original test execution date. And then to compound the issue, the test results and historian timestamp, not the instrument timestamp, were displayed on the electronic batch record review. So they were seeing they could see an old test with today's date. And then looking at paper records, it was noticed that some entries on a training record for visual inspection on a filling line were in the same handwriting for 9 operators who documented that training occurred on a particular date. Looking then at the electronic batch log for the filling line on the training date for the time frame specified, it appeared that normal processing activities or a production batch were in progress during the time period in which this training was supposed to have been occurring on the line. So what happened there? What was the explanation for that? And moving on then to some case studies. So as these issues, they may appear small, they start building up and up and up. In this case, the composite sample for the product was tested for water content, and the result was also used in a validated HPLC anhydrous assay calculation by a chromatographic data system. The water content result reported was out of specification. And through the normal route in the lab, this was investigated and the root cause was determined to be a labeling error. A new composite sample was created and the test repeated. The water content results were within specification. So if you're taking a linear path, the investigation is complete, root cause assigned, brilliant, happy days, well done. But to be fair, in this study, the company applied some critical thinking. They questioned how the HPLC assay could be within specification if the water content was out of specification. A second analyst then executed a manual calculation in line with that that's presented in the test method. An out-of-specification assay result was obtained, and it transpired that this assay result was consistent to an in-specification result of a different formulation for the same product. So the question is, what was actually tested? It was determined that the HPLC system itself included the capability to utilize additional fields in the processing sequence as either multipliers, divisors, and custom calculations for the secondary processing of results. And a review of all the chromatographic processing conducted by this particular analyst on the original composite for the affected loss indicated that they utilized the divisor field to mathematically transform what would have been an out-of-specification HPLC result to one within specification. So in this case, they'd actually manipulated the results, so falsification. And the investigation had determined a number of personnel were involved. So what was the consequence of that? Well, unreleased product was held. They had to notify all the relevant regulatory authorities. The scope of the issue had to be determined. They had to conduct some health hazard evaluations and patient impact assessments, see if there was any recalls that needed to occur. They had to execute a risk assessment to determine all the risks associated and determine mitigations of those risks to the process. They had to requalify their analysts responsible for HPLC testing. They also had to retest everything that was on hold and that they had access to. And they had to implement a system of utilizing a data review independent of QC laboratory operations until confidence was rebuilt in the process. So big deal, and I suppose at high cost to the company. In the second case study, a company had completed data integrity assessments and mitigation within the production area. So they had done some work on it, and they'd implemented some new controls for the review of periodic qualification activities which were performed by an external company. A review of the data for a periodic qualification for a piece of equipment was performed against these new controls. Similarities with data printouts associated with reports versus previous activities were identified. It was determined that the same data, albeit slightly modified, was repackaged for subsequent qualification activities. So again, what was the consequence? Now it's not related to batches, it's related to maintenance or calibration of equipment. It's a bigger deal. All unreleased product was on hold and an investigation raised. The relevant authorities around the world were notified. The equipment had to be requalified, and then the impact of the issue had to be assessed on the validated state of equipment, on the product manufactured on that equipment, and ultimately the patient. So a bigger deal, a huge cost, and I would imagine they had very high level of regulatory oversight from multiple agencies while this was ongoing. So really, again, from a small little gap or a small issue, it just mushroomed up into a huge issue for them. So to conclude and to kind of finalise, really, what are the take-home messages of the presentation? Really, to get an understanding of the criticality and risk of data and know what they are, and understand that the life cycle is not just the electronic data and computer system. It spins out everywhere into the paper-based process. And then assess data integrity across the business process, including the back end, and always apply critical thinking. So always be thinking, well, okay, it's following our procedure, but is our procedure good enough? And again, always join the dots. And I think then that's it for me. So thanks for listening, and I'll hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Paul. We do have quite a fair number of questions in the chat window. If you guys have more questions, please feel free. But we're going to start in with Heather Longden. She asked, is PICS cooperation different to that of the FDA or EU MRA cooperation?
It is, yeah. It's purely voluntary, but it includes, I think it includes the majority of the EMA agencies, so the EU agencies. It includes FDA are part of it, so it's not legally binding. It's really to try and, my understanding is it's really to try and align expectations so that one agency isn't looking for items that other agency isn't, or if there are some kind of new agencies that are kind of building up from the ground up in some countries, like for example maybe in some African countries, that there's a base level, there's somewhere they can go and there's somewhere they can get help and get guidance, and so that's really I think the purpose of this. But it is, I think from the European perspective, I think they have adopted, it's not citable, I guess, is what I would probably say, with the exception from the European side of the Annex, the interpretation of PICS interpretation of Annex 1, which was adopted by the European Commission. So you'll never be cited against this, but it gives an insight up to what the agencies are generally looking for, and on some of the aidment wires, it goes into the types of questions they should be asking and really how they should be checking it. So it is an absolute, it's a fantastic reservoir of information to really just build your system and make sure your system is asking the same types of questions, or your internal audit program is looking at the same type of things.
Yeah, I think as well that the members of PICS are allowed, can just call up other agencies who are members and say, have you ever been to this company, or could you share an inspection report from something? And I think they'll share them. But with the MRA,
I think I certainly know from my past experience that there may be some legal issues with that. So it's under MRA for sure, but I'm not sure outside of that.
I think with the MRA as well, that they will accept the findings of the other agency, whereas that's certainly something that PICS doesn't do.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
We have another question from Debbie. Are there examples of how data criticality was evaluated for a system? Do you have any examples that you might be able to point to?
I think the most critical data of your process are the quality attributes of whatever it is you're making. That would always, I would think, would be the starting point. What's on the C of A? What's registered? They're the most critical pieces of data. Without that, you don't have a product. So, and then you'd kind of work your way back. Now, so then you'd have the validation data or that type of data that's used to support the product data. So that's also critical. But then the further out you go, there may be elements which are less critical. And I think one line of the European Annex 11 document, which always jumps out in my mind, is a little line that says the consequence of bad data should be known and understood. And that's supposed to be from the validation stage. So when you're doing, so of the data you're generating, what's the, if it goes bad or if it's not right, what does that mean for the process? And really that's asking in its own way, I suppose, for a data criticality assessment as part of the generation of the validation path for the process. So for me, I would always start with as a starting point, because there's a mountain of data in every facility. But I'd start with what's on the C of A, what's registered. They're deemed to be the quality critical, and I in terms of trying to go from zero to something, that's where I would start.
Thank you. Then next question is, should IT help desk, DBAs, database administrators, and application administrators be prevented from deleting, amending, or recreating data? It is often not possible to restrict that, so how to address that in a risk assessment is the question.
What would be what procedural controls are in place? So the DBAs, I think, are I don't want to, if there's any DBAs on the phone, on the line, I don't want to kind of not having a go. It's more, that's the biggest risk. There's no trail. if there's some data manipulation going on, and be it intentional or unintentional. So really then you'd have to look at what are the procedures around that, what are the controls around that, who audits that, and how do you know that it's only, is there a formalized mechanism for request and then reconciliation of that request, so a review and approval of the request and data change has been made correctly, and that's really I think that would really help if that type of information was there. So you may not have electronic controls, but what are the procedural controls and how are they enforced and how are they inspected or reviewed by your internal audit teams or indeed within the department?
One interesting angle that people have looked at it is that if those people have admin access, would they even do they have any interest in the data? Do they have any knowledge of how the data fits together, works, what the implication of it? Because if they don't, then the only way they're really going to be able to do anything dangerous or whatever would be if they're collaborating with somebody from the business who does know how to do that stuff. And I think they were in that original regulations for the US. It just said without the collaboration of 2 or more people. And that's what I've always thought that was kind of referring to, is like, yeah, there may be an admin somewhere who potentially could do something, but would he even understand it or know what the implication is unless somebody from the operations side came to him and asked him to collaborate in fraud?
If it's fraud, I guess it depends on intention, whether it's intentional or unintentional. Some unintentional things that kind of jump into my mind is, what if there's an alarm going off in a manufacturing area? The guys think they have it sorted, but their pal is working in IT and they ask them to disable the alarm, it's just, as a favor kind of thing, to kind of either short circuit a process or there is no process. And the admin in that case has no idea what that alarm even means or not. His pal has called him and said, yeah, look, it's fine, we have it sorted. So it's for me, it was always more the unintended consequence or the unintended manipulation. Would that be detected? Because it still has the same effect,
Yeah.
Next question. If data is to be excluded from a record or a calculation, do you think electronic signature authorization to be excluded or rejected is a good practice? And then it goes on to say, traditional reviewers just sign the approved data. So maybe you can speak to the interstitiary steps.
Yeah. So my question is immediately, but why aren't they approving the other data? If you bring it back to paper and to that slide, if there's been a number of processes, I'm just thinking of a chromatography system. If there's been a number of processing operations carried out, why would you only accept the last one? If it was a paper record, essentially the other processing operations would have a line out through them. They'd have a signature and a date and usually a comment as to why it was incorrect. So it's the same type of approach. And what I suppose what you need to, again using chromatography systems, what you need to be able to do is reconcile everything that's been run on your GXP equipment. If there's been an analysis or a test injection or something that's been performed, what's the purpose of that test injection? And how do you know that wasn't somebody just running a control, or how can you prove it wasn't somebody running an actual sample, doing an on-screen review which doesn't generate a result? And if it's an experienced analyst or somebody who knows what they're doing, they know what the area count should be roughly to get a passing result. So it's really to how do you know what your system is being used for, and that it's not being used for any kind of falsification, be it intentional or unintentional, would be the question I would have back.
Let's see. In practice, less sophisticated systems often assign all permissions to an administrator user group. When it is desirable to have a separation between those administration systems and those that create data, what is your recommendation to mitigate this risk? I think that's going back a little bit to what we just talked to, but maybe you can further expand on that.
Yeah, it's kind of slight tangent. In some smaller laboratories, you may have 2 people in a small laboratory, and they're both performing analysis and they're both administering the system. So what do you do there? And I think something I imagine an approach to possibly take would be they have two accounts, and then so they have an administrator account and they have a user account, and then part of the review of the documentation could be to see, well, what account was it performed under by the second person. So when they were doing an analysis, is it under the user account versus doing administrative duties? And then they would check each other's administrative duties. I mean, you're trying to mitigate the risk. You'll never truly eliminate it, but you should really mitigate it. But if it's either all or nothing in terms of access, then the question should be, what checks are done on the work the administrator has performed after they've performed it to ensure there's been no inadvertent data not manipulation is the wrong word, but inadvertent data issues from the work they were doing. You know, that would be the way you could catch it at the back end, is that they're not the same person, and a review of the work an administrator has performed is carried out and documented.
I believe that draft PICS guidance actually does talk about that in some detail.
Let's see, so another one from Heather here. The boundary really ought to include people. Would you agree with that?
Yep, I would indeed. I've always, in my head, in the past, I always kind of looked at, when you look at the V model, you've got your IQ of a system, you've got your OQ of a system, you've got your PQ of a system, and I always thought the equivalent of a process validation, a PV or a PPQ, would be running the business process and seeing what happens. Because that's essentially what a product, that's what a process validation is. It's you're running your process to see if the equipment as you built it gives you the product that you expect to get. So then look, kind of take that across, run the whole system with procedures, people, and everything, and then to see do you get your desired output. That was always kind of in my mind. Ideally, that's what you'd like to see, but I don't know how practical that would be. But yeah,
and I guess that goes to the thing where people are saying, you know, there's the question in a number of the guidances that says, you know, can you rely entirely on vendor qualification testing in these kind of systems? Well, if you're going to look at the people that are in your lab and the procedures you have, or in the system, or the operators that you have on the manufacturing floor, that's really exercising exactly how it's going to be used going forward. It gives you so much more.
Do we have any other questions? I think if you look in the chat window, there's some good comments from Paul and from Mark. Thank you for providing those. If there are further questions, please post them now.
Oh, I just had one question, because I'm always interested in how to put people when they uncover a data integrity concern, you know, what do you go about it? And you did a good job of explaining some of the steps that had to be taken, but I wondered what your thoughts were about if the route that the failure or the gap or whatever you want to call it was uncovered might influence the thoroughness of the mediation. I say this because I wonder sometimes, you know, if we said you had that thing where people in the lab there were a whole bunch of them, they were all knew that if you change some number, then things could pass. Well, if one of those people had raised it and you addressed it from an internal observation, do you think there's a difference in rigor to the approach of fixing it versus whether if an inspector or an auditor from outside comes in and finds it, you know, and it gets written up as a deviation? You could look at it that, you know, it's the same thing, you should treat it the same way, it should be done the same way, but I'm pretty sure that in practice, if it's found in an audit, then it gets addressed either much more thoroughly or with much more vigor than if it's somebody in the lab raises their hand to say, hold on a minute, this isn't the right way to use the system.
Yeah, well, I suppose the associated investigation would then have to look at everything that was tested or everything that was done from the moment the piece was put into service up until that point, because then everything is under question at that point. So even if it is, if it is, I mean, and as I read those issues there, they seem to be self-identified by the company, and then when they look at it, they kind of think, oh, crikey, the scope of this is huge. And within the PICS document, it goes through what the expectation of notification to authorities is, and then what the expectation on authorities for what authorities should do, going down into assigning criticality to deficiencies, are captured within the document. So I think if there is, it's really the notification that will be triggered by a data integrity issue, I would imagine, which has the potential to impact product that's on the market, because then immediately you have a potential patient population that's at risk. So I don't know how you could not inform if you're to follow the guide, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's in an ideal world, that's what people will do. But I'm pretty sure that in the real world, that if something gets discovered in an inspection or an audit, more resources are thrown at it. Let's put it that way, than if it's something that's just found internally. Or the sense of urgency to remediate maybe is the thing that's a little different.
And that's where the governance comes in. That's where the governance comes in. And the governance describes how it's managed, how it's escalated, and how it's dealt with. And that's the idea behind the governance process. So you'd be looking for a strong governance process, or else that's the foundation. And if that's not there, then the rest of it is kind of pointless or worthless, you know.
I think, hi, this is Alison. I think I'd add to that if an observation was found by the lab, they would probably treat it in quite a small way with a narrow impact, whereas if the same observation was found by an inspector, then the deemed risk could be a lot greater with wider impact.
And that's I think that may be the case, but that's where the system, I suppose, the investigation system has to change, and that's where the data integrity concepts need to be brought in. What does it mean? What's the impact? What's the consequence of the bad data needs to be looked at, you know? Yeah. So that's down to, again, the governance process, the procedures and practices then that are kind of dropped in to a quality system.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, Paul hopefully posted the question 15 from the FDA guidance about, you know, and I think it's in the PICS guidance as well, that you really should, if you do find issues that you think have an impact on patient safety, you need to be reporting it. And it says as well, though, that it shouldn't be, you still need to report whatever field alerts and other things you need to do anyway, so it shouldn't supersede that or interfere with that. But they do want you to voluntarily say, we found this thing, we've got this remediation plan, we're on to a good, you know, a good outcome at the end of it. But that the reporting of those data integrity issues is really important. So thanks, Paul, for reminding us of that.
I think the guide talked about what type of information that the regulators, just as I look at it here, would be expecting to see, what type of CAPAs, you know, just what to include in the report where possible, if it's just from notification through to detailed investigation.
Thanks, Paul. It's really, really informative. Really enjoyed it.
I think we don't have any other questions that are coming. So I think at this point, I really wanted to thank you, Paul, for speaking. And I invite others, if you have ideas on topics that you'd like to present, please let me know. Or if you yourself would like to be a presenter on a data integrity topic, please let me know. I provided my email in the chat window. But I just wanted to thank you all for your participation today, and I wish you well. Thank you for joining.